Hi. If you're anything like me, you probably sometimes want to know where my shirt is. Maybe that information was mentioned in a podcast somewhere, but how are you going to find it? Are you going to personally watch all the episodes of The Integral Stage and all the adjacent meta community podcasts, hoping to stumble on the information? Don't be stupid. That's too long of time. How would you even know you're checking the right podcasts? Instead, go to the Apple App Store on the internets and get Fathom.fm. Fathom.fm is a meta podcast platform that not only figures out which podcasts you should be listening to, but which parts of those podcasts contain the answers to the questions you're interested in. Fathom.fm is making podcasts searchable, instantly chapterizable, and transcribable, and training up teams of suspiciously intelligent AIs to do the work for us. The digital universe is becoming curated by conversations and interfaced with through automated dialogue processes. So if you want to put yourself in the best position for digital synchronicity and distributed sense-making this year, you may have to submit to our Robot Masters. Ask your doctor if cyborg interfacing is right for you. Fathom.fm. I do it.
Welcome back, folks, non-folks, quasi-folks, whatever you got. This is a totally cash integral stage celebratory special that I'm calling Unlimited Hangout, a retrospective inquiry in which we'll be eulogizing and assimilating the Limited Hangout project, which is, of course, the still little known but highly potent mark to beat when it comes to integral level conspiracy theory and subject matter associated with marginalized sense-making styles. Hey, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Let's do the narrative here. How did you guys hook up? How did you get started? What was the mission and why is it concluding?
Korg, you want me to go or?
Well, yeah, we might want to start with you doing your
The fact that
to
I'm out.
your face.
Well, I mean, Korg and I have known each other for some time, including around the integral world. And we were approached about 2018 by someone who had also been around the integral world for a while, who happened to do quite well for himself in the crypto world, and he wanted to see a different. At that time, the integral dark web, not the integral dark web, the intellectual dark web or whatever, kind of had a moment, and this fellow wanted to see someone jump in the middle of that stream, and he had a budget in mind and for a project, and I thought, well, I could do that. We could do that. And approached Korg, and we jumped in, and we were both already starting to get into paranormal material, and also some parapolitical or conspiracy or what have you. So, but I think when we started, Korg once joked, it was like a little boutique thing that started, and then the culture went nuts. I mean, everything from 2019 on, we just got swept up in this we were kind of swept up in the middle of everything that was going on, from UFOs are real to Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself to the pandemic to everything else. So I think it really morphed and flowed with all that happened. And why is it ending now? I think it just felt like a time. We thought it was going to be a 2-year project. It's been 4, so January 2019 is when it started, and I think it just came to kind of just that time. I don't know, maybe Korg can add some other elements.
Yeah, I think that's that's a good review, and definitely, boutique is a word, or we were kind of playing on some fringes and some fun elements, and then all of a sudden a wave of events came that we were sort of just maybe a little ahead of, and then just sort of surfed for a few years, which turned out to be a really interesting dynamic to see all these seemingly odd, strange highways and byways that we'd been kind of interested in, just kind of going with gut feeling, actually become major topics that people in everyday life were talking about all of a sudden. That was a really surreal moment for sure.
But the obvious thing here is that one of you is concealed and one of you is not. What are both your logics for the way you're showing up at the moment?
Well, let me start because it'll be similar for Korg. I think when we started 4 years ago, The culture war was pretty intense. I think it's flagged a little bit now, but cancel culture was very powerful. And parts of the insane left will come after you after your livelihood. I didn't want them going after my wife's business or livelihood. It's also, I had two very young children at the time, and I just didn't really have a lot of extra in the tank to be arguing or fighting online or fighting in the comment section or whatever. And partly, we've always said it was aesthetic too. Partly it was fun, and also partly, I think 4 years ago it felt slightly more dangerous to be talking about some of these topics. I don't feel that anymore, but certainly in the 90s into the 2000s, there was a lot of people who were studying the parapolitical and the paranormal who either were murdered or suicided or had strange deaths. So it could be a dangerous thing to be writing on. I think there's just too many people in the space now. There's too many people with podcasts. There's too many people aware. They can't, as Whitney Webb said, they can't kill us all. So that was probably part of that's another part of why we were cloaked or what have you. For myself, it just seems time. I want to speak in my own voice, but to be honest with you, Layman, I am a minister in the church and have a strong relationship with God. And last month in December, I was just cooking eggs one morning, cooking breakfast for my kids. And I got this huge download that just said, it's time. I want you out in the court with your real name and your full self. And so, when that speaks, I listen. So that's why I'm doing it.
What about you, Korg? No egg-related message from God? How come?
Not yet. Not so far. Yeah, I mean, the thing Zeke, Trev was talking about there, certainly apply in terms of wanting to have a degree of, it's not a high degree, but at least some degree of some protection. So that seems wise. And even, when we started, reasons that he laid out, but also in a way it was like the Korg persona or the writing voice took on a bit of its own life in a fun way. So it seemed right for me, at least for now, maybe at some point. Although if people figure out, he's out now, so it won't take like Sherlock Holmes to figure out who I am. If anybody wants to, go down that, spend a bit of time, it won't be too hard to figure out who's behind this voice. But yeah, which is fine. But yeah, I just felt like the character deserved his, final run here, I guess.
Oh, aesthetic integrity. I appreciate that.
I will say real briefly too that we had a pretty serious conversation in March of 2020 when the pandemic and just everything, all the shit seemed to be hitting the fan, and we had a kind of a moral discussion like, should we be out? So we almost decloaked then, but I think it was right to wait.
But Trevor, you mentioned kind of two danger sets, right? One danger set might be people that wish to thwart certain kinds of discussions from taking place because they have some kind of control infrastructure that they've been trying to defend over the years. Right. The other one is a certain kind of pseudo-leftist danger. And that's interesting to me because it does seem like when we get involved in these topics, a lot of people have a tendency to end up going down right-wing rabbit holes. And a lot of other people have a tendency to assume that anybody discussing these things has gone down a right-wing rabbit hole.
Yeah.
What's your take on why that is?
Well, I think it's a really important point you make. And I think what's unfortunate, I think that has more to do, honestly, with the last, let's go since Trump came down the escalator. So 2015 to now, everything's been flipped on its head. In the history of conspiracy research or parapolitical research, you have a lot of leftists, even still some of the elders like Joe Eugenua, Douglas Valentine, who wrote on the Phoenix program, these guys, they're all Democrat leftists. One of the greatest books on the JFK assassination is by a guy named Jim Douglas, classic minister leftist. I mean, the guy who coined the term, who Korg and I love, Peter Dale Scott, coined the term parapolitics. He popularized the term the deep state, and he, all these other, he's a historian. Well, he was a leftist poet at Berkeley, and he was friends with Chomsky and Howard Zinn. So it's unfortunate. And, the point I made too is that actually the left has been on the brunt of a lot of this clandestine covert actions by the CIA and other intelligence COINTELPRO, famous things we know about, Operation Chaos. The left's been on the brunt of that. So I think it's a weird time now where, where everybody seemed to be on the right if you're talking about this, but that it certainly just hasn't always been the case. But what I was trying to say there was that I think all of a sudden, if you look into this material, you're a MAGA loser, you're a whatever Nazi, all the things that they get said. So people kind of pull back or pull away, so there's been this division. I think it's unfortunate. It hasn't always been the case.
You got a take on that, Korg? Why has this stuff become associated with the right, especially given what Trevor said about how often throughout history it's been the left that's borne the brunt of these kind of assaults, and the left that's tried to point out that other patterns were at play behind the surface?
Yeah, it is. It's a really important one. I got a couple thoughts. The first is the shift from, I think the shift of most of the left becoming neoliberal, becoming so dominated by neoliberalism is a big part of it. And so, the 90s, like No Logo and the anti-globalization kind of crowd of the 90s, or the anti-war, the anti-Iraq war movement, in the early 2000s, that was mostly a left-wing phenomenon in the Bush, and that was seen as like, the power structure. And if one was sort of opposed to that or saw shady business, then one might find themselves on that side of it. But through the 2000s, neoliberalism controls the left, at least in parliamentary or democratic places or political situations. And there's been a move away in the left, particularly in the US, but you can see it in Europe and Canada and elsewhere, of like the white working class being kind of written off by the left due to various, factors we could get into. And that crew becomes the basis of a right-wing anti-globalization movement. And they get it more into like nationalism, they can have various more right-wing traditions of how they would oppose a globalist kind of agenda. So I think that becomes a seedbed, starts on the internet. Trump is sort of the high watermark, whatever you want to say, of that movement. But you can also see other nationalist types like Bolsonaro or, Duarte, or any of these kind of characters that are sort of Trump-esque that have been popping up all over the place. So I think that's one part of it, is just that the left got really moved into the globalist framework. So if you're anti-globalism, you may have found yourself moving to the right into a more nationalistic kind of space. The other one I would say, which has to do especially with the movement since 2020, is the weaponization of reason and of science. So if you really want to get at a liberal, like liberalism's, like going back to its classical roots in the Western Enlightenment, we can argue about progressive policies, we can have arguments about race stuff and gender and all that. But if you really want to get it, I think at the core of liberalism, you attack it's reason. It's the argument about reason and rationality, and the deep fundamental fear of anybody who identifies in that way of being called irrational or anti-science or a denier or any of these kind of loaded terms that are around. And I think the weaponization of science and scientism as a belief system has had a huge part to play in what's going on. So if someone is opposed to mainstream narratives, then they get labeled a believer in whatever system, and that seems to put them in a traditionalist, theoretically right-wing kind of disposition. Those are the two main things, that pop into my head.
What stands out to me listening to that is this sense that the liberal modern system is a little bit of hollow simulation of itself, that it's actually been breeding a lot of people who are pre-modern in their sensibilities and pretending that they're modern just because they're participating in the system. And there's sort of a constant unveiling of the pre-rational orientation toward reason. There's not just scientism, but there's a kind of authority-based, consensus-based belief and membership culture around being a member of a rational liberal society. It has this tendency to populate itself with people who aren't really embodying its value system. Another thing that leapt out at me was, when I listen to people who are more right or more left, let's say, within the integral and the meta-modern spaces, there's a couple kinds of issues that stand out. On the meta right, I hear a lot of people opening up to opening past the liberal, realizing that a lot of things that are important and valuable have been left out of the dominant liberal narrative. So as they open to new kinds of topics, they're also opening sympathetically to rural and traditional and mythic, all those kinds of sensibilities that have also been neglected. The irrational, the transrational, the right brain, all that kind of stuff makes them more sensitive to the right. And at the same time, the meta-progressives and the integral left are so focused on a certain class of issues, economy, ecology, human rights, things like that, that they seem to me anxious about introducing additional conversation topics. They don't want conspiracy, paranormal. They don't want that to distract from the need to reformat the economy and take a hard shift on the way we're dealing with the environment. I'm wondering what you guys have seen over the last couple of years in how the higher discourse spaces are relating to these kind of themes that you deal with. Are they more open? Are they more closed? Have you seen any shifts?
One of the things you said there, I want to highlight, because there's sort of this rejection of traditionalism. From an integral perspective, it's obvious. It's the blue meme. It's just these things should be integrated. I also think there's a distinction. I'm going to go back to your point in a minute. That it's a distinction between. I've come to understand a distinction between the far right. And when I think of that, I think honestly like, the Nazis, far right politicians, and conservatives. It's a difference, because I've been around conservatives now for the last 4 or 5 years online, America First, Patriots. It's just, there's good salt of the earth people. I mean, I just think there's a distinction needs to be made. Yeah, they might have a different view on abortion or might be more Christian or what have you. But I think the really hardcore, the Alan Dulleses and those kind of fascists who truly, wanted to and continue to want to rule the world, it's different than just small c conservatives. I would say I had to walk away from a lot of sort of left spaces, integral spaces online or what have you, because it seemed very closed off to this conversation. And I needed to, go down my own road, do my own research. But I will say one line that I really loved from a guy named Michael Rechtenwald. And I got to give him credit for this, because he was a professor. He's one of the first professors canceled in 2016. So he's a lifelong Marxist, and he critiques what he's seeing in the woke kind of left, and he gets canceled, loses his professorship somewhere in New York City. And he's really changed, become a libertarian. He writes for the Mises Institute. He's very, very critical. But one of the things, an insight he had, was that the left has had some people on the left anyway, or in the literati or the very educated class, have had their narcissism weaponized against them, because only stupid people will believe in the conspiracies. Only idiots and hicks and MAGA turds will. So, and they get to feel higher than that, through this weaponization, I think, of the media and the elite to really, so their own narcissism gets weaponized against them. And, you don't have to scratch too far below the surface. I know Korg would agree to see lots of conspiring going on, especially the economic realm. That's what's unfortunate to me. It's like when we talk about, you're talking about the left and, how we got to turn this economy around and everything else. But if you don't understand, in my opinion, that, the elite don't care about any of us, and there's a lot of clandestine, covert. If we don't understand what they're up to, then this economy will never change. And they give us a lot of lip service of sort of utopic values, but that's not what they have in mind. So if we could pull the cloak back a little bit, I think we would be able to retake some of those economy pieces. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. But anyway, Korg.
Yeah, and I think Whitney Webb, you referenced earlier, she has a series. I think she's done the first, she and her co-author.
Ian Davis, yeah.
Yeah, Ian Davis. They've done at least the first part that I've read of what I think is going to be an ongoing series, which is the parapolitical meets kind of the green agenda. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the tricky parts about this world is parapolitical, because, if it becomes an emotional culture war thing, then you're asked, are you pro the environment? Are you whatever, pro gas and oil, or you're a non-believer or whatever? And I'm pro care for the earth, but that doesn't mean I automatically follow the way practically and the power agenda that's covering itself. That's, in this case, we could say greenwashing or cloaking itself in care for the earth, which is really, and their article goes into profound depth about permits and how they've been developed from the same guys who created the derivatives markets, that created the housing bubble, how it's going to lead to government, private partnerships or transnational sort of entities basically getting the rights to fishing and minerals and farming in other countries. It's just colonialism by another name that just happens to have this time, instead of in the 19th century, it was to Christianize all the heathens supposedly and culture them. Now it's like, now we got to save the earth. But it's that same cover of saviorism masking really dark intent, power intent. And in this case, it's covered by, care for the earth, so that if you oppose the specific policies, then the immediate emotional response is you don't care about the earth. What are you, some shill for big oil? And then that's just a really easy way to shut it down. It's like, no, I care about the earth. I also just care about the people that you're going to use the earth, quote unquote, to be your cover for taking their land. That seems to be more of a problem to me. So it's tricky that positive, progressive visions and, like Trev was saying, utopic, well-valued systems can easily become the rhetoric and the cover but actually to dig into the policies and to see how power is actually operating, you see that it's two different levels for sure. And that level of analysis, I think it's harder to do. It takes more time and effort, and it's not an easy, like, let me get in the comment section and zing back at somebody else. It's like, wait a minute, this is actually a thing. And it puts one in a difficult position, because it's like, I don't want to be a, advocate for big corporate dynamics, but I'm also not an advocate for these kind of permit-based and so-called sustainability systems that are really just another version of kind of green colonialism.
Mm-hmm. I'll come back to the question I was going to ask, because there's something interesting about what you just said, which is the importance of this depth of analysis. And it takes time and it takes effort. And it's, some of the good work you guys have been doing and putting that effort in. I'm wondering how much of this attitudinal shift can be accomplished inwardly and how much it requires some kind of external analytical apparatus. Because when we look at the things that were just being discussed, we can say, well, of course, from an integral or developmental point of view, the artifacts, the ideas, the moods that go along with each of the levels, that's just content. Once they're created, anybody at any level can use that. It's something that seems like it comes from green or teal or whatever, can be used by orange systems, can be used by blue sensibilities. So we expect that, and we would suggest that some kind of authenticity of internal development would increase a person's sophistication and depth and ability to hold those things and grow past that trickery. But is that enough, right? How much can be accomplished by internal development, and how much do we need some additional resources of deeper deconstructive analysis on this stuff?
I can take a crack at that first. I think it's a great question. I think it's an important question because how do I want to put this without inflaming? I mean, there's a lot of very spiritually realized people who have, fallen for many cons, by the elite, myself included. I've woken up from that programming in phases and phases. So just because you hit Satori, 10 times in whatever retreat, I don't somehow, and you'd be way more capable of thinking this through in terms of the complexities, Layman, but lots of very, very deep or spiritually advanced people have fallen for many disguises. So I think it's been important for me to really read history. I feel very grateful for the last 6 months I took to really look into the 60s with the COINTELPRO, et cetera, into things like Jonestown, into the facts of Iran-Contra, the drug running in the 80s. Once I started to see that, and that's why with this series I'm writing called The Network, I want to give people a place where they can really take in that information and go, wow, if you see the heroin empires that the CIA has created both in Southeast Asia and then in Afghanistan, there's a third in there in the middle, but and just the carnage on these places. This, once the necessity was done of just the carnage on those countries, the addiction, the heroin. Oh yeah, Burma was another one. Anyway, once you sort of see those facts, you're like, speak for myself and some people I know that have read my work and give me feedback. It's just like, wow, the scales come off in a little way, that when you have George H.W. Bush in the 80s on TV, as the drugs are speaking, holding a piece of crack, going, this is a piece of crack and this is an epidemic in our country, blah, blah, blah. We got to be on drugs. And he is the king of the operation bringing in the cocaine. So you see these people lie. And so I think the facts of history have helped really to open myself up to that. So I can speak for myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we wrote quite a bit on in multiple articles is just the emotional, and we talked a little bit, I think, the last time we were on, but the psychologically jarring and emotional titration and regulation while one is kind of on a path of having these scales come off. And I agree with Trev that, usually I find for folks who find their way into this world, it's usually like one topic, whether it's, the JFK assassination or UFOs or whatever the specific doorway is for someone. There's a point where someone has to face, like, there's pieces of evidence that have been occluded.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where language about conspiracy theory is really unhelpful, because then immediately it becomes like, do you believe these theories? Do you not believe them? Like it's some belief, dogmatic kind of thing. But if you take, JFK, you just have to be open to the possibility of other pieces of data that got occluded. And then you can start to see through the existing narratives like magic bullets. At some point when there's some kind of narrative that is attempting to be pushed to keep out other pieces of information, which may well be trying to hide some version of a conspiracy, then inevitably what happens is the story ends up with these farcical elements, like the normal kind of the stereotypical version of the conspiracy theories is like highly astute, Machiavellian super geniuses who are writing up all these storylines down in some dark place somewhere, and they're coming out with this, super sophisticated. But actually, when you study them, they end up in farce. Like a bullet's supposed to like flip around in midair and then fly against the laws of physics, or Jeffrey Epstein decided to take his life in a cell. It just happened to be when the cameras were like, it's just so over the top ludicrous that there's almost a point where I wonder, like, are people just effing with our minds? Like it's so ridiculous. Like, it's not highly sophisticated. There are moments, if you really look into these things, that the gaps are so great that they have to come up with these just absolutely farcical explanations.
Mhm.
And it's at that moment that one is really like, oh, there's other pieces of evidence. The existing narrative starts to be seen through whatever the main version of events is that's meaning to occlude things. And then one has to be open to other potential hypotheses. And this is where there are a number of ditches to fall in, I would say. Like, there's a number of dead ends, and those are what we generally call junk conspiracy. Like, at the point at which a person might be open to an alternative set of explanations, there are any number of disinfo campaigns and junk conspiracy kind of stuff that can kind of divert someone off into a strange subworld that is equally problematic as any kind of farcical mainstream narrative. And to be able to walk that middle road does help to have other people who have walked a similar path, because it's very easy to get confused once one is taking the courageous step of dropping away from the imposed official narratives. It doesn't automatically mean someone's going to get into a place of greater insight that can easily get diverted, like kind of like Pilgrim's Progress. There's like like the pond of despair. It's like all these kind of, places that can become ditches, I think, in the road. And so we tried to really hew that middle road and talk about the emotional impacts of this kind of stuff and the individual transformation, but also being connected to the larger analytic point.
I really appreciate the attempt, because one of the obvious ditches is just sort of confusion and overwhelm.
Mhm.
A guy wrote that great book on chaos, on the government and the Manson family and his sort of 30-year investigation into it.
Had to turn up my-
Yeah.
So
Tom O'Neill.
About
Yeah.
that book is he doesn't really draw conclusions. He doesn't say, here's what happened. He says,
Yeah.
this was going on and these things definitely didn't happen the way they were said. But what leaves you with just a sense of the world that's so multifarious and so confused and so mysterious, you feel like you don't know where to go. And as you pick up these additional pieces of information and try to use them in your sense making, isn't there such a risk of overwhelm that you either don't want to hear this information or you want a very simple cartoonish story to take care of it, because you needed to make a simplified sense in order to just take action in your own life. Most people don't have the resources or the time to stand in front of how unbelievably peculiar and unintelligible and mysterious and multifarious this all is.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. And just to talk about your last point too, or what Korg was talking about there with junk conspiracy, it's been a learning on the ground lesson the last 5 years of people get inserted all the time into those spaces to drive people away with hopium, it's called, fantastical stories of Jisara, the whole reset of the economy. Oh my God. I mean, they have people operatives get inserted in the space to drive people into crazy ends. So you're at risk in that space, but it's fascinating. And we know that there's, the UK has the 77th Brigade, which is all online. I could go through the other intelligence agencies. They all have these units. But in terms of the overwhelm, Korg, you go for a second to collect my thoughts. Okay.
Yeah. One of the pieces that I wrote was taking Kubler-Ross's work around grief processing and applied it to kind of the parapolitical path and a sort of analog. So the time where there'll be denial, the time where there'll be a lot of anger and rage if the denial comes off, to be like, we've been screwed with, I can't believe. And there's then the period of despair and potential compromise, periods of fear, possibilities. And it was a really interesting way to look, I thought, at when I started looking at these kind of sub pockets of groups of folks within this kind of world, I'm like, oh, I can see this person is in kind of the resignation, despair place, and then maybe they'll move through that. And so I think, not that it's all just about our own individual emotional processing, because there are objective factors at play, but to have this kind of, to walk this path does involve an internal death and rebirth. Like, it just does. And they don't have to follow the exact linear model. That's just a model, but just one way of trying to help make sense of how emotionally powerful, but also intense it can be to come up against the revelation that there's a whole, we call it underground, but it keeps showing up above ground. I mean, that's like Epstein would be a classic example there. It's these moments where Peter Dale Scott's term, the deep state, it's where where a deep event occurs, where this occluded layer of political and social reality, which involves typically criminal syndicates, black markets, intelligence agencies, complicated global corporate banking scenarios, public-private partnership dynamics, these kind of actors, when they go from being somewhat behind the curtain or just off screen for just a moment, show up right front and center stage. And then for a moment, there's a bit of an opening, and then immediately the existing narrative structure has to come in with, again, these ultimately farcical attempts to close that door immediately and move that, exit stage left at that point. And so the things that seem anomalous or mysterious are only so in terms of the existing worldview, the dominant narrative. They become less, they're not fully transparent, but they become definitely less opaque, far less opaque, when we have a framework that's open to this kind of data and then tries to develop a worldview that makes plausible things like these kinds of events, of whether it's assassinations or whether it's drug running or whether it's follow the money, or the way in which colonialism can show back up under the green agenda. They become less surprising, truthfully.
And I would add too, I remember what I was going to say, which is that over time, Korg and I did a presentation on the Stoa. People might want to check it out. And we just went through some core concepts, because or the pattern of these players, mostly intelligence agencies in league with, as Korg says, often organized crime, but their playbook's pretty limited, and you can get to know it. So like here a couple examples: agent provocateurs, classic, used all the time. And we have whistleblowers over the years. Lewis Tackwood in 1972, he was a great example of a whistleblower who was an agent provocateur. Patsies, I mean, a classic thing is a patsy, and they're very useful. So when you get to know the playbook, and another one I throw out there, and we talked about in that talk, but is the false flag, right? Now it's funny, when we started writing Limited Hangout, the false flag was something that was still like, it's just conspiracy theorists talk about. It's actually a long history with them. They're very effective as well. But it was funny. I don't know if you noticed this, Korg, but right before the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or somewhere in that start of that war, the Western media started saying Russia is going to do a false flag. And I was like, what? You're just talking about this now? So, but the playbook's quite limited, actually, and it's very repetitive. And so I think, what we've both been trying to do, and I'll try to continue to do, and I've learned from a lot of others, and is give people those tools. I mean, one thing I might suggest to people is this book here. It's brand new. It's the Citizen's Guide to Fifth Generational Warfare, written by General Michael Flynn and another guy, Boone Cutler, who was in the psychological warfare division. That's just come out. It's a huge bestseller, and it's basically a workbook, but you're going to get all these concepts in there, and people can really help to. It's put out so that we can be defensive against these operations, because 5 generational warfare, as we switch from 4th generational, which is insurgencies and little bands of guerrillas who, that kind of thing. To it's a war for the narrative, it's a war for the mind, it's psi war. And so once we can start to see how those things work, then we can pick them off pretty quickly. And it's been awesome to watch over the past 3-4 years, people really grow in capacity and strength. When I mean people like all across Twitter to Telegram to, at the beginning of the Ukraine war, again, it was like, hey, that's an old video game. Or people are looking at a photo and they're like, shh, and they're like, no, that's from 2011. It's like, that's fake foot. I mean, there's guys there was people just nailing them within hours. Back in the day, when the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that lie took us 4 years, 5 years, 10 years before we could admit that was a lie. Now in like hours, people are calling out the ops. And I think that's great. We're becoming stronger to this kind of persuasion or engineering. So, yeah.
That's great. That's very edifying, because it seems like it's very easy to become completely like distrustful once you start to see the edges and complexities that are involved. But if there's a fairly limited repertoire, if you only have to learn a certain alphabet of moves, that's quite plausible. We could all learn a small alphabet of moves. So I appreciate that. I'm curious how you guys avoid the problem of becoming the distressed, relationally dysfunctional prophet figure, right? Because when people pick up some of the additional facts, or even the possibility of additional facts, very often they just want to insist them to everybody else all the time, and it ruins their relationships and it ruins their credibility. And people in general often don't take the topic seriously, merely because these people are such communicatively deranged figures who are always insisting everyone else agree about these additional facts. So how do you guys sidestep that pitfall?
Want me to go, Korg, or you want to start?
Yeah. Okay. There's a learning curve for sure. Don't know how far along that I am, but I find, first, I don't like to sort of start to impose that. I don't find this I'm more interested in if a person starts to express an opinion, or the topics that I do find that are a little more, that don't immediately, like if you start going off on like the JFK assassination or whatever, like that's not the place to start typically, or paperclip, and we brought in all these Nazis after World War II, and like that's probably maybe not the place always to start. But I'm really fascinated by the whole angle of this work that is human origins, and like the pyramids, and are they far older than we thought they were? So this can be kind of the Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson kind of, and others kind of topic, which is an interesting one at the moment, because Hancock's documentary is on Netflix and he got a bunch of pushback and people want to shut it down and cancel him and whatever. But that seems to be maybe one area that's kind of more, because it just opens up a possibility of like, I don't know what's going on there. I don't think any of us know what's potentially really going on in those cases, but it doesn't have quite the nefarious element right off the top that some of the others that would be more present, political, war, death, destruction, assassination, are obviously going to bring in like a different level of, it's going to heighten the emotionality, where it's like, maybe these kind of story that we were all just like in these small little hunter-gatherer bands, and then somehow we just like built pyramids, because we had some logs and we rolled around, 10 tons stones on some logs. Maybe that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems to be maybe a gentler entry point for one, and then certainly kind of the other one that's real popular at the moment, obviously, is the UFO phenomenon. And so if people start to ask about that, then I'll say what I think. And again, it's really helpful to talk about, I find, the distinction between a level of data and evidence that might be currently anomalous, and to distinguish or differentiate that from the hypotheses. So like in the Graham Hancock example, the data that he's taking is the data that's being occluded by mainstream archaeology, like that there's water erosion on the Sphinx. And if the Sphinx is as old as the official story is, it doesn't make any sense because it was a desert then. But there's a time where there was a lot of rainfall. It would just be a lot earlier. So that's like a piece of data. He's then got a hypothesis. He has his account of how he's trying to make sense of and interpret this kind of anomalous data, which for him is a pre-flood, pre-Younger Dryas cataclysm civilization that mostly got wiped out and left these remnants. Now, that hypothesis may or may not eventually play out, or maybe in parts it will, or maybe it needs to be revived as hypotheses get to be, further tested. But what he's pointing to first and foremost is the data that's not being taken into account by the mainstream narrative. Like somebody might come up with an alternative, equally or potentially even more plausible hypothesis. I don't know what that would be, but they would at least take that data seriously. His main beef is that they're writing off so much of this data because it doesn't exist. It doesn't fit their existing narrative. And so the ability to talk about the data level, whether it's the UFO phenomenon, which doesn't mean you have to believe in an extraterrestrial hypothesis to explain that phenomenon, or there's all this wild, weird stuff with pyramids and the Sphinx got water on it and Göbekli Tepe, and we were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, and then we were supposed to figure out agriculture, and then we were supposed to build temples, but it turns out the temples are older than agriculture, so there goes that story. At least at that level, it's getting first to the opening to different possibilities without immediately trying to impose a narrative of how that should be interpreted. I find is a more helpful entry point.
And from my end, I would say, what you point out is it's a big danger. A lot of people do it, like the proselytizer. It's the same as getting, finding Jesus, and I got to tell everybody, it's a real pitfall. I haven't done that, but I will say it's been hard to live over the last 5 years in a certain way. Sometimes it can feel very lonely, when I'm with my in-laws, or when I'm with, gathering with neighbors, having barbecues, it's mostly just me biting my tongue, but, and that's okay. And I just try to focus on things that we have in common: food, kids, life, whatever. I don't, I'd stay out of it, and if people ask, part of why, coming out now too, if people want to have this conversation, the world has been pretty damn wacky over the past 4 or 5 years. I'm happy to, and I've written a lot that they could be pointed towards, or happy to talk about it. I would say that I don't know if it's a blessing, but reality has given us a lot of things over the last 5 years. Bill Cosby's in jail, Weinstein's in jail, the Ghislaine Maxwell's in jail, Epstein thing, government's now admitting the UFOs are real. I could go down the line here, but there's a lot of sort of facts on the table. Over the last decade too, we've known that the pedophilia rings that were this is probably going on YouTube, but I'll try in that Catholic Church, that's now knowledge, rather than these are a lot of things that were in the past only the sort of the realm of rumors or conspiracy. But so that helps. I would say my wife had an experience recently at her workplace where someone was over lunch mocking conspiracy theorists or whatever, and my wife just said to him, "Yeah, do you know who Jeffrey Epstein is?" And she was like, "No, never heard of that person." "Oh, well, you should check it out. Ghislaine Maxwell's in jail and they're running an operation for 25 years. Oh, okay, maybe I'll go take a look. So, and I also had there's other things that happen. People, that come to you and they're like, really something wasn't adding up. They're being lied to. You can look at the Twitter files now. We know that, all that censorship was happening. And they're like, "Wow, this is crazy." And they're like, "Yeah, man, totally. Let's talk about it. Let's have a beer." I had my cleaner. She was an awesome woman. She was really thrown off during the pandemic, and she'd seen my books kicking around my table for my writing. He's like, "Do you think sometime we could have coffee? I've seen your books." So I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." So, I try to wait for invitations, but the proselytizer is extremely annoying, and I know it's a problem.
It's interesting to think about the culture changing a little bit. Like on the one hand, we've got a lot more information, so it's a lot easier to find things. We're in a shift in terms of what the dominant media is. So there's like an in-between space where you can say a bunch of stuff because the old information controllers are losing power relative to the new systems. There's the fact that the world seems objectively to have gotten so strange
Yes.
And we keep not solving our crises. So I think there's a burgeoning sense of all options on the table now.
Yeah.
But that's in the world. What about in you guys? What's changed for you over 4 years of doing this project? Korg?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, one of the pieces I wrote was back to something Trevor was talking about earlier, whether you want to think of them as in integral lingo, separate lines of development or whatever, but how one might have, and this was certainly through my own experience in this, like a path that was more oriented to a classically spiritual awakening, and then have missed the boat on this side of things. So I was trying to reincorporate the language of, woke, not in like the way it's been, but the way it's become, but the way it was originally meant, as a kind of a awakening of a conscience, of a different understanding, not in a sort of metaphysical, but in a more political and social reality. And the piece with the Kubler-Ross was a reflection, certainly, in my own experience of a period of a whole lot of rage, and a period of a whole lot of fear, and a period of a whole lot of grief, and periods coming close to despair, right? So how those have moved through in the Kubler-Ross thing, there's acceptance as stage 5, but then some of our students came up with sort of a stage 6, which is like creative action, not just getting to a place of acceptance, but then like a forward movement. And I certainly feel like as we're closing, this chapter with the project, I feel like my energy wants to move that way now. I definitely feel not like one's ever over it or whatever, but there's definitely been a threshold of transformation that has been crossed, that I'm like able to talk about this topic now. Obviously it has emotional tenor, because if we're talking about the really rough stuff, it's rough, but in a way that's not dysregulating, in a way that just feels normal. I feel like I have a right-sized view of both not underestimating the network and various forces and psychological operations. I've studied enough of the history to know how hidden but also influential, and in many cases very destructive it's been. But also not to get into another version that can happen in the conspiracy world, which I would see as more like a variation of a black pill or a kind of despair place, which is like the controllers, the committee that controls and runs the world, and what can we do? And I don't want to fall into that kind of a resignation space either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agnostic.
Yeah, exactly.
For myself, I think, reflecting here, it's a great question. I'm happy as someone who in my early 20s, I had that sense, like in the Matrix, where Morpheus says, you've had a sense all your life. You didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. I've always felt that, and so I have an anarchist tattoo on my hand. I became, I deeply read in Marxism and political economy and things like that. And I'm grateful that I found my way into parapolitics and understanding that it's not just capitalism, in my opinion, or whatever. The elite have a religion, which is something that's important. They have various worldviews. They're pro-eugenics. They're Malthusians, and understanding just the Western elite I'm talking about, the Anglo-American establishment. To understand them and their goals, and has been very helpful to seeing what's wrong and why it's wrong. My first red pill was around 2012. We don't have to get in that story, but it was around human trafficking, child trafficking, and various Christian organizations that work with that. And at that time, I had like a stain, like a black stain on my soul that lasted for like 6 months. I was just sick, and that's gone away, and I don't really feel that anymore. I just I put on the armor of God. I feel good. I don't feel negative in that way. And as Korg says, the black pilling is a real problem with a lot of people in the parapolitical conspiracy world, and that it's too monolithic, in my opinion. And everything, the whole system, is rotten. And it's actually not, I've come to understand that's very not true. People have been fighting back. There's all kinds of whistleblowers in every agency. All kinds of people have been fighting back internally to this kind of, I would call it evil. It's not fully corrupt. It's not, and I would say over the last 5 years, it's been fun to be in those networks on the Telegram and the Gab and the Twitter of people all across the world, because what we've gone through has been very, it was a global thing, the pandemic, and it was very lockstep in messaging and what happened. So, and it's been awesome to watch people kind of in different stages awaken to some of that. And then, I don't know, it's a giant band of soldiers. And, there's been a lot of laughter. I mean, the meme warfare has been great. Honestly, every night there's like 2-3 memes I see that just like gut laugh. That's just funny shit. So the human spirit's alive. I think honestly, humanity is maturing and growing in a certain way. I think there has been a darkness under this surface that has been very hidden and has been, I think one time we were on with you, Layman, we used that term from Twin Peaks, the Garmonbosia. How the guy eats our Garmonbosia, and I think these Western elite have been doing that, and it's been making us very, very sick. And I think now it's on the stage, and the fight is, we know what's going. It's a little more overt, and I think this is positive. So, I think the future could be very positive, but it's a daily fight. But
I'm curious what you guys look back on as pieces that you contributed to this project that you're the proudest of. What are you really happy to have written or created for this thing?
There's a piece I wrote on scientism as a public cover for magic still being practiced and understood in certain circles. So officially we live in a kind of secular scientific frame, and then behind the scenes, the history, certainly since Newton on and earlier, is that all these guys are also into like Hermeticism, they're into magic, they're into the occult, they're into some interesting stuff. And if you get rid of the notion of consciousness and intentionality as publicly real, then it allows a certain segment to control it and to use it. Mm-hmm. And the example I use is the first episode of Neil deGrasse Tyson's second season of Cosmos. And the first story that he tells in episode 1 is about Giordano Bruno. And they tell the tale in a limited hangout, but hence the name. So limited hangout is when you leak some of the information, but then you keep another part hidden and you spin it in a way that allows you to still control it, even though it appears like it's been a leak or it's been a discovery of some op or whatever. And so Bruno, in this version of PBS Cosmos, is the great martyr for science against the evil institutional church. And of course, that's part of the story, but they leave out the whole part where Bruno's understandings and 500 years ahead of time, 400 years ahead of time, presaging thoughts about Einsteinian cosmology came from a mystical experience. And as well as his whole criticism of the banking structure and how that may have played into things, his whole possibility that he was part of a secret society. The whole setup is that he's this kind of martyr for reason. But Bruno was also a magician and a realizer. And that part of the story gets completely left out. As well as the way in which the church of today, that magisterium, is not the church. It's that old guard of scientism are really the magisterium. So they take this character who's actually completely shows you that intentionality, psi phenomenon, conscious reality, and the paranormal is completely real, and they're using him as their martyr for their scientism. So that to me, I think, has been it was quite a thing to do the research for that piece and then see that come up and be like, oh my God, this is literally in my, like, here it is. Like, this is literally the episode that's showing exactly what we're talking about. So that's one that I spent a lot of time on. Yeah.
For myself, I've done a series of long form posts, and a sort of little body of work has come out of it. And I'm glad for all of it. You know, I did one on called Naomi Klein's Bridge, and it's on MK Ultra and neoliberalism and the weaponization of social science research then and now. A big one on the spectacle. So, you know, I think that body of research has been very edifying for myself. But again, I think as part of fifth generational warfare, we're in information warfare. So I'm trying to do the work. We had this lovely benefactor. We were getting paid to do it and do the work so that people who didn't have time could read it and, get a quick bite chunk, well, in 45 minutes or whatever. But and then lately has come out this series I've been calling The Network, and I will continue that on my Substack. My Substack is named, I was hoping it was going to be ready by this interview, but it's taken me a while to put some of these posts back in the back end because of all the links and everything. But it's called Take the Sword. And if you look at Ezekiel 73 in about 3 weeks and Take the Sword, I'll continue that series on The Network. The next one will be on Watergate, and then we'll get into Jonestown and a whole bunch of other things. And again, it's just helping people to know some of this history and to see, to read for themselves. Again, I don't want to get bogged down in Jonestown, but some of these things are so nefarious. It's just be a history basically of all those different scandals that went on, the Bank of Commerce and the BCCI scandal, savings and loan scandal of the 80s. There's so much that went down. I mean, these people are crooks. They're absolute crooks. It's like, the ruling political elite are basically organized crime, in my opinion. And if you don't believe me, then read that series and you'll see it's 100% true. So I'm proud of that. Again, it's just my contribution to the information war.
The other one, yeah, I mean, there was so many topics we
Korg wrote behind the pieces. So.
Yeah. There were a lot that I wrote on the UFO phenomenon was another main, and the ways that it showed up in all kinds of, in a sort of angular or just obliquely or this kind of strange entry point into places so we used a lot of, the subtitle of the site was around ontological flooding, which is a term from Jack Hunter, which allowed us to bring in things like a trauma lens in relationship to abduction phenomena, and how might that play if we bring these two kind of models together in a way that, and let them kind of be creatively in friction with each other. So there's a whole slew or series on UFOs as well. Yeah.
I've told Korg it could easily be a standalone book, all his writings on that field.
Yeah.
I just had a conversation yesterday with a guy who's hoping to create what he was calling like a meta-modern space to infuse the disclosure movement around UFOs. And it left me thinking, what do we need? We have some things. You guys have got resources out there. Stuart Davis created his Experiencer group, and Sean Hargens has got the Institute for Exo Studies. All of that's in the UFO space.
Mm-hmm.
But it shows that some of the meta community is orienting toward it. What do we still need? What does the space of these paraphysical and paranormal and anomalous ideas need in order to take it forward in a way that's responsible and conforms to the sensibility of higher integrative thinking?
Can I take a crack at that real quick?
Yeah. Jump in.
Well, thing that comes up for me, I think what needs to be known is Korg and I are both a fan of someone called Dark Journalist, Daniel List, and he's very good. He's fact-based. He knows his stuff. It's quality, and he's as good as anybody on this disclosure, this realm. And he talks about something called the UFO file, and it's amazing. It's been at the heart all along. JFK, Nixon, the whole way, this UFO file. And he says there's also a group called X-Protect, and they're basically essentially an assassination squad of any. There's part of the elite who wants to keep this, because there's tech involved, and there's tech that honestly could free humanity involved. and they want to keep it to themselves. Actually, he talks about, Dark Journalist talks about another group, actually. What does he call them? X Disclosure? X. But my point here is his work is very good, but you have to understand that there's a lot at stake, and even right now there's a wrestling in various parts of, I don't see the quote unquote deep state in America as monolithic. I see it as kind of has factions. And so there's a wrestling match going on currently. But the only point I would just make is that, we got to let's go deep down, or just have to understand that there's a lot of stake here, and there's been a lot of violence committed to keep that hidden. But why? And maybe Korg can talk more about this. And it goes back to this conversation about ecology and everything else, because 0 point energy or free energy are these things that they're being suppressed, and they have been. Many people have had their patents ripped off. Many people have been their lives destroyed who were trying to create their own of these. So there's something big at stake in the heart of that. And I guess I just put that on the table. We have to understand that problem as we approach it. But Korg.
Yeah, absolutely. Even just, I think a few days ago I read, I don't know what the update is, but Randall Carlson, I think,
right,
taped an interview with Joe Rogan.
Yep.
And Randall Carlson's, if you don't know who he is, he's this fascinating polymath naturalist. I don't even know what to call him, but character who's been really interested in this idea of catastrophism. And there's a thing called the Younger Dryas, which maybe was a series of meteor showers, and that connects back to the Graham Hancock idea and stories of global floods and things, which they're taking as maybe remembered history. Anyway, Randall Carlson taped a thing with Joe Rogan that was about some guy who's working on a similar, call it abundant energy or 0 point or free energy or over unity or whatever you want to call it. And they've, for the moment, maybe that's going to change by the time this comes out or later, like they've put it on hold. And I'm not sure even why. Like they're not sure they're going to publish it or not, because it could cause some, I don't know, controversy or whatever. So that's, I think you're right, Trey. Like at the heart of, just even the thing itself, like in the TikTok video, which is the one out of San Diego, and that's been big in terms of the U.S. Defense Department admitting the reality of UFOs, whatever that means. These, whatever we're calling it, phenomena, is a violation of the textbook physics that everyone learns in school. So right off the bat there, you've got every potential door that opens up. You don't have to think that they're necessarily spacemen from outer space who are going to bring, intergalactic harmony and peace, but like, just if we get away from the various kind of hypotheses and even the more sort of out there ones, like something is occurring in that phenomenon that is both consciousness oriented and simultaneously physical. And its physical reality has consciousness effects, and consciousness somehow is affecting the physicality. And there goes scientism, and there goes materialism. Plus, if it has the ability to be, as Richard Dolan would say, you never see a UFO parked at a gas station, like up its tank, right? Like if it's powered by and has some other elegance, or it has some ability to tap existing energy in nature in a very elegant fashion, then we've got questions about all the various corporate power structures around energy and energy management and energy sustainability and control and distribution. It's like one, you pull that thread and that whole sweater can come undone. And so for sure, the major history of psychological operations since the end of World War II and before around this specific phenomenon indicates that there's some serious heat there, whatever's exactly at the nature of that phenomenon.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? Yeah. I remember how Dark Journalist puts it. He says, people who research a lot of the parapolitical, they don't do enough paranormal. And people who are in the paranormal don't do enough of the parapolitical. And in this case is the case for that. The two sides need to come together, because they're, let's just take the JFK assassination. There's 50, 60 years of excellent scholarship on that. But the UFO file, he wanted to open that up. He wanted to discuss it with the Russians. He wanted to bring that forth. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason. It's one of the reasons I believe he was assassinated, but that's playing out, and it continues to play out. So anyway, bringing those two things together. And I'll just say real quickly that there's a book called Hidden Energy, and it's got two women who are the authors, and it's a bunch of essays in there. And one of them, I will say, I think Jeanne is her name, but she was trained in spiral dynamics. So just so it's not that kooky, it's close to this integral world too. Hidden Energy, and it's all about this, this suppression of these technologies that really changed the game here on Earth.
Yeah, and Richard Dolan's great, he wrote these 2 volumes which is kind of the magisterial study of encounters with this phenomenon by Air Force and military the world over, and he covers, 40 years or something. And the 2 volumes, and the main conclusion he draws from all of that research is that the UFO phenomenon is like the most important hidden element of the entire geopolitical reality of the 20th century. Yeah. That the Cold War, as we understand it, is not just a Cold War between the US and the Soviets and the remnants of the post-Nazi factions that went in either direction, but is actually also an entire psychological operation to keep hidden this phenomenon. So that's pretty wild to think of it as having that level of an influence in our so-called above ground history. And then to have 60 years, 70 years of anybody who talks about this subject as a kook, and it's all, your tinfoil hat and you're a nutter. And then for the, US, like the Navy and the Air Force, like, oh yeah, they're real. and then just kind of walk off stage, and to drop that in the middle of everybody going, because all the quarantines and the shutdowns and all this madness is going on, and in the midst of that madness, they just like, oh, by the way, UFOs are real, and then they just immediately dart off stage. It's like, wait a minute, what the hell? So what's that all about? How do you switch? What's behind the switch from the official version that it's all weather balloons and, people with disturbed dreams and whatnot, to, okay, it's real. Now we're just going to walk off stage, and what's that presaging? So
yeah,
fun times, interesting times to be alive. That's for sure.
What does the future of revelations look like? Based on how this one went, and you can put out that amount of information to make that kind of a public confession, and basically everything still holds together. So maybe it's safe to just stop covering things up.
There you go. Be adults about it. Yeah, all right. People had affairs. People got assassinated. Whatever. I mean, fair enough. It was funny though, watching that people's reaction to that. People are like, yeah, that's cool.
I was watching a stand-up comedian who was talking about the UFO thing getting dropped in COVID, and the line that struck with me is like, so I told my wife, apparently UFOs are real, and she just went about her day.
Yeah. I mean, the CIA has a Twitter page. There's which is already itself kind of a what is going on in the world, if that exists. But they wasn't it a Halloween thing? Do you remember this one, Trev, where they said, oh, by the way, we've faked alien abductions, haha. And I think it was supposed to be like a Halloween themed joke, but there are times where it's actually disturbing stories. It's not like, and it's on the CIA Twitter page, but they faked them being aliens to abduct people and do psychological operations and torture people and try to get information from that. That actually really happened. Whatever else is occurring vis-a-vis this phenomenon, it itself can be faked. This is the real mind bender, right? It's not just like, oh, the whole thing's fake. That means the CIA faked the whole thing. They could be faking something real. Like a counterfeiting is the example that's often brought up for people who do that kind of research. It's like they counterfeit real bills. You don't counterfeit money that doesn't exist, because that won't get you anywhere. If you're fake printing money, or counterfeiting, you're doing real money. So there's something strange about counterfeiting something that may also itself be real.
It's very difficult, it seems, to get a feel for how to hold the danger of this stuff. You know, when you guys start talking about the level of investment, the level of danger, all the forces that are involved, it triggers warning bells for people. You go, well, are they exaggerating how potent this is, how dangerous that is? But on the other hand, when you start to look into the records and dig into a lot of the additional data, you go, well, there's pretty consistent patterns of awful things happening here. So, you know, given the tendency of all of us emotionally to exaggerate danger, and given the fact that there are real dangers at play, which we have difficulty emotionally taking seriously, how do you gauge how careful to be, how worried to be?
It's a good question. I mean, what you asked earlier, you know, how have I changed in this process? And I think, especially around issues of child trafficking and things like this, I become much more, how do I say this? I'm very much more protective of my children and where I let them go and be, and, you know, because these things are real. And at the same time, I talk to my son, and it's like, you know, I said, there's bad people in the world. There's some bad people in the world. But you know what? I love the world. I love this life. I love the earth. I love eating. I love singing. I love dancing. I love animals. Life's great. I love it. And there's danger. There's real evil in the cosmos. And some people, you know, through their own abuse and trauma, you know, participate in that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I try to hold, you know, a middle ground. Definitely that power, that dangerous power, they're homicidal, but they're not, they're also stupid. They're arrogant. They're in a bubble, you know. Yeah, they have assassins. Okay. They do. I mean, you know, the mafia had one mafia group had like 100 hitmen. Okay. Like they have assassins, but I don't think we need to be afraid of it. Ultimately, I think the more awareness, you know, awareness shines light and into that darkness. And I think more and more people are becoming aware, throwing off of the television, throwing off of the news. You know, so there's two answers that I answered that question two ways. One about my son, and one I don't think ultimately it's as dangerous as we might think.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier about like learning the playbook, learning the tactics of the English translation is psychological operations or psychological warfare, but the literal translation from the German term is worldview warfare, which was a term coined by the Nazis, of course. So if you think of it as warfare on worldview and on sense making, then it's important to understand the nature of the tactics and the strategies involved in said war, because one is unfortunately participant in that climate, whether or not you want to be or not. You know, it's a war chosen not by me or any of us, but imposed upon. So I think of it in terms of that level of responsibility, so that I'm not, as much as possible, getting hoodwinked by these tactics. And then, because I want to be aware and I want to be cognizant when some of the shadiness is afoot. But also, like Trav was saying, like, I just want to like creatively live life. I don't want it to be like that this is the reality and then somehow I'm in only relationship to this. Like, this reality is important, this parapolitical one that we've been describing, because it's very easy to bypass it, because it is really uncomfortable, because there is some dark stuff, because there is brutality in history, and it's easier just to act like that's not real. But on the other hand, it's no good to just fall and collapse into it, because we were talking earlier about black pills, as if like this is the whole reality, is just these guys control, or whoever, they control the whole world and everything that happens. No,
Yeah.
But it's important to know that there are forces that are hell-bent and have been for quite some time on, like Peter Thiel's got a company named Palantir, which is a Minority Report pre-crime AI type thing. The Palantir, for those of you who remember your Tolkien, your Lord of the Rings, the Palantiri are seeing stones that Sauron creates and uses to confuse the mind of Saruman and to turn him evil. They're surveillance objects. That's Saruman, the all-seeing eye. Couldn't get a more perfect literary description of surveillance system. Creates seeing stones to watch people and to mess with their minds. And that's who he named the company after. Right? When we're talking about these, like, oh, is these highly sophisticated? It's behind the scenes. It's pretty out in the open. To advocate for a value that, like, who else, like, read all the Lord of the Rings books or watched the movies and thought to yourself that, like, Sauron's the good guy? Who, like, that's the kind of a worldview we're talking about. That's a very distorted, I would say, view of the world. If you're naming the company in honor of surveillance objects of the all-seeing eye, that tells something right away that, to me, it's not good. So I want to be aware of that, and aware that, back to our discussion right at the beginning of, like, how did the left get pulled off of conspiracy? Of all the people, as we talked about at the beginning, who should be worried about surveillance and the history of COINTELPRO and, the infiltration of the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers and you name it, it ought to be the left. And here's a perfect example of it playing out yet again in our time, a more advanced, sophisticated version technologically, but the same game, just with fancier computers now, but literally named in honor of Sauron, which is nuts that it's that up front.
I would add a couple other pieces if I can, real quickly. I mean, one thing that pops to mind is, Whitney Webb has her new 2 books, One Nation Under Blackmail. And of course, she's doing a lot of interviews, and I listen to probably, 10, 15. And a lot of interviewers will ask her, like, are you scared, knowing the history of journalists like Gary Webb or Danny Casolaro. And she just said, I'm not going to live like that. They can't kill us all. And I refuse to live like that. We can't live in fear of these people, And another thing I would say is more and more people become aware of things like the World Economic Forum, and which is, formed by the CIA, and you can read Johnny Vedmore's work on Limited Hangout, but not our site, on Whitney website. But, a lot of people had eyes on. There's a lot of eyes on this year. And, and these people just look buffoonish, Klaus Schwab just looks nuts. It's like this guy's out of like at the beat, like the comedy version someone make about a James Bond movie. It's like these guys, it's like all the Bond villains in one room just staying as stupid as shit. So, I think that's helpful too. A lot of people are listening to these guys going, these guys, people is crazy. They're just in a bubble, and how many yes men are around them, oh, that was great. That was great. Great job. Great speech. Imagine all the yes men around Bill Gates, oh, that was you handled that Epstein question really well. These guys are, so I don't think, as much as they can have violence as a weapon, I don't think they're that scary or even that smart at this point.
So you've got this phenomenon that occurs socially involving networks and individuals who can marshal elite resources, but who have the dumbness of regular people and are somewhat socially retarded by the structure the interfaces set up around them. And they operate dangerously with homicidal lethality as a parapolitical layer of organization in our system, with special emphasis on paranormal, anomalous, and advanced tech areas. So all of that is a classic evil conspiracy. Is there any significant good conspiracy from the data you guys have looked at? Are there any networks of people who understand and use these things but are doing it benevolently, or is that just a kind of fantasy?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, the word conspiracy means literally to breathe with. to breathe together, to conspire. So there's actually Christian theology referring to the life of the Trinity, the doctrine in Christianity of the Godhead, as a conspiracy, as a conspiring, a breathing together of the divine persons in that system. So conspiracy just means anytime people have that level of intimacy and connection, we could say literally the word just means that they breathe together. Now it's typically become, like a group gets together and they want to, depose the king or something, or run a coup, and so they're a conspiracy, or some local crime lord pays off the police or the judges or the mayor or something, and then you have a conspiracy. But really, anytime people are getting together to conspire, then the intentionality might actually be for goodness. They might just be breathing together based on the idea that they want to, build communal networks of love and solidarity. So I think there's lots of conspiracies going on, both of the benevolent and of the not so benevolent kind. We got to be on the lookout for both, actually, I think.
Oh man, you're opening up such a can of worms with this question, man. But I'm going to give you two answers: a non-answer, and then I'll do something else. But I have followed the QAnon phenomenon since the very beginning. I was a participant observer in it. I wrote 5 articles on it. And so I could go into that material, and it continues, or other material such as devolution. There's people who think that currently the United States government is under continuity of government operations, but I will leave that aside. I mean, I could talk. As part of my worldview, I will be writing about it, so I'm not going to hide on that. But it's a fraught subject because the counter op from the media against it's been actually very successful, and so it's almost impossible to get inside that. But I will say this, that I have found over the past 6 months of researching into the network material. There was a book, I think I sent it to you, Korg, but it's kind of resurfaced. I'd never heard about it before, but it was Carl Oglesby, who was a leftist, was a part of the students, SBG students, anyway, were it was a really strident kind of left society or a group. And he wrote a book in 1977 called The Cowboy Yankee War. And it was subtitled Conspiracies from JFK to Watergate. And what he argued, his thesis in there, and again, I've also just started hearing it over the past 6 months in different podcasts, but was that there's a nationalist element in the United States, deep state, and there's this globalist one that comes from the Anglo-American establishment, and they've been at loggerheads. So I say nationalists, I mean they're into the founding fathers, the U.S. Constitution. They're patriots. They like that system, and they've been at loggerheads fighting each other for a long time. And one of the it'd be too long to go into, but one of the most amazing stories, and I will write about it in these series, was there was a group, and these are real people, in the late 90s of former CIA officers. One of them, Chuck Hayes, is the famous one. He was called, the Angel of Death or something. But these guys, they went rogue because the government had been so infiltrated with corruption. They went rogue, and they had a copy of the Promise software. It's a whole nother thing, but they could get in the back door of a lot of things. And they were finding all this corruption in senators, and they were getting it all in finding where their bank accounts, and they were getting these whole files on these people. And they went to them and dropped it off and said, you're not running for re-election again, or you're done, basically. And they claimed to have had 30 different senators and congressmen do that. Eventually, Chuck Hayes was set up by the FBI. He and his trial has been, the transcripts of his trial have never come out. They've been deemed national security. So that's just one example. There's lots. So I do think there are forces. I would say I see the battle at this point between sovereignty and globalism. And I think there is forces around the world, say the BRICS coalition and things like that, that are tired of being dominated by the Western elite. And there's lots to show that they've been working together to sort of make a multipolar world rather. Sorry. So yeah, those are some of the things I would say. And then the last thing I would just say is, Ben, is back to the public. I mean, they can't stop millions and millions of aware people with eyes on them. They just can't stop that. And, some people refer to it as the Great Awakening, whatever. I do think whatever you want to call it, that is occurring for sure. And it's happened to me. I'm taking part in it. And I think, yeah, it's just growing exponentially, and they're screwed with that being the case.
The maybe this is the last question. There are these meta communities of people trying to do new sense making, whether it's integral, meta modern, game B, overlapping, penetrating communities. But their attempt to bring together all kinds of different forms of knowing and all kinds of different value systems, all kinds of different disciplines, to create a large, integrated, good operating system for collectively making sense of the world we live in. It seems in general to be dominated by a consensus view of what the fragments are that we need to integrate. There's a lot of tendency to leave out the kinds of anomalous facts, whatever they turn out to be in their precision, that you guys keep pointing to. How far do you think those communities can get without folding in these extra facts? Can it be largely successful, or is it significantly hamstrung by not paying attention to these kinds of epistemological domains that you guys are exploring?
Want me to take that first?
Yeah, go for
it. I've come to pretty strongly believe that they will get absolutely nowhere in that project without what we're talking about, integrating it. And I wrote a piece called "What's the Deal with Kevin Spacey?" and then it was subtitled "Or the Problem with Game B." And I just think that if we don't understand the clandestine, if we don't understand what the elites, who they are, I think it's like a lot of psychopathy in the elites, a lot of psychopaths, and then we'll get nowhere with all the pretty words in the world. We'll get nowhere unless we understand that they have an agenda. It's not hidden. Klaus Schwab writes about it in his books. The elite have written about, they write it openly, right out and then right in their books. Their agenda is very open, and we're going to get nowhere unless we resist that agenda, understand it, especially central bank digital currencies. To me, that's the end. We're done if that happens. So just understanding their agenda, understanding, how blackmail works. I think Whitney Webb's book's very, very important, and it's fact-based, right? Because you can compromise politicians, you can compromise stars, and the stars tell the people what to think. And I mean, and it goes way back to the 1920s. It's fascinating stuff. So I think we don't understand the rot in the system and how it perpetuates itself. We can integrate all the things in the world. Hey, how about we just integrate these pieces too? That's all I'm saying. I want to be a part of those conversations. I wish, I was hoping on the site to write more about like Bigfoot and fun stuff, but it's like I came to realize, oh shit, no, we're screwed if we don't know this layer of reality is happening. That's my answer.
Yeah, strong answer. I would say on more the anomalous sort of interior experience side, not as a bypass to what Trev just said, but just in the supplement to or addition to, because as we've been saying throughout, like the two go hand in hand. I mean, at the root of much of the whole forms of large scale experiments on human beings that became the base, what we call MK Ultra, shorthand for a whole series of stuff, was dosing people with LSD, was hypnosis techniques. It was parapsychological phenomena at the core of it. It wasn't ancillary. It was right at the heart of it. So if those kind of communities are coming together and they're going to leave out hypnagogic states, shamanic dream work, plant medicine, communication. I mean, some of them will talk about some of those aspects. and others not so much. Those are domains that I think, again, back like in the UFO phenomenon, have a lot of potential creativity associated with them, but they also have ways to be distorted and weaponized. And so I don't think we're going to get through the various crises that are before us through greater application of only, not, I shouldn't say we're throwing it out, but just like more, 5-year management plans and more like sustainability goals. And here's how we uphold ourselves. And here's how we rationally get through this difficult, like we're going to have to tap different modes of knowing, different modes of feeling, different modes of intelligence that I think have been part of our human story for a long time and maybe got pushed aside for a couple hundred years. But that zone is not itself, it's ambivalent. It has both possibilities to benevolence and lessen benevolence, and can be intentionally manipulated. And that is at the heart of this whole parapolitical. It's not just drug running. It's not just, there's all that assassinations. You can go, there's that side of it that seems still very secular and parapolitical or conspiratorial. But any deep dive into this immediately touches into parapsychological phenomena are at the heart of this whole thing. And there's some piece of knowing, sensing, intelligence that is the heart of it that has been weaponized. And we need to regain that understanding in order to move forward, I think.
Can I add one thing to that, Korg, on that side of things? That's why it's important, I think, I have over time, one last time we talked, Layman, I mentioned that Jeremy Johnson got me into Eric Davis's podcast. And that's when I started learning about magic and all that, all those realms, animism, and all these different things. And then eventually got to Rune Soup and Gordon White, and who's a chaos magician. So I've come to believe that there's reality there. There's there you can do magic, and the elite do it. And they do ritual magic on us, and they have rituals. And our favorite person who interprets this, his name is Christopher Knowles, Secret Sun blogspot. He's been doing it for 25 years. But if we're not, and they elites will do a whole bunch of different things on exact astrological dates, and Gordon White calls these power multipliers. You might get some extra out of it. Doesn't mean they're like total sorcerers on us, but they are doing this stuff. And so in one piece I wrote, I said the greatest conspiracy of all time is scientific materialism. The fact that we had that whole world, that animistic world, taken away from us into a deadened world, and then they get to continue to use these practices when we don't even know they're occurring. So I think those things need to be reintegrated. There's white magic and black magic we can connect. Anyway, we can use that as well. But if we don't know that it's constantly being used, we're just sitting ducks,
Well, I don't know if I would call this retrospective celebratory, but maybe with a cautiously optimistic twinge.
Yeah.
Can I real say briefly, just mention that we had about, I think it was $12,000 left in the budget. And when we decided to shut down the project, and we have donated that to the Integral Stage. So you're doing great work, man. I was seeing how many different like brands do you have? Like how many shows do you have? Like 15? Or I was like, it's pretty amazing. You're pretty prolific, but it's great. And thanks, for giving us a platform to talk about, as you say, these things that might need to be integrated. We think so. I'd love to meet anybody in these meta modern worlds who wants to talk or whatever. But anyway, keep doing the great work, and I'm happy that we could just throw a little bones your way.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's thanks for having us on. All the times we've been on, and for the support. And it's definitely it's a bit wild and weird of a subject matter to tackle. But yeah, I think throughout this whole conversation, we're just trying to say there's been a lot of events that have occurred that don't make sense within the narratives that most of us were raised in.
True.
And back to this idea of like trying to take data seriously and then trying to make our sense making take seriously data that otherwise just gets written off. That's really all we've been trying to do. And this is a whole series of data that shows that there have been various, organized forms of interference and nefariousness, and that doesn't rule the world, but it also can't just be bypassed or pretended like it's not real. It needs to be faced directly. It needs to be understood because it's ongoing. It's not just something in the past. It has plenty of history. You can study the history, and that history is important because that history is still present reality. And hopefully, I think that shines a light. And then, as Trev's been saying, there's humor, there's creativity, there's goodness. When we have that kind of materialism or scientism is the greatest conspiracy, it's not actually allowing us to be in touch with real materiality. And so when we're getting to a layer of deeper embodiment and real connection to life and goodness and our humanity and nature, that's where I find hope, and that's where I find inspiration and source of a sense of goodness and a possibility of creative efforts forward.